Coming up next, coverage of the closing session of the International Conference on AIDS. You will see Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Louis Sullivan, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and others addressing the conference. This closing session took place on Sunday in San Francisco. Demonstrators heckled Secretary Sullivan throughout his address and made his remarks very difficult to understand.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Ziegler. I'm the chair of the Sixth International Conference on AIDS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the closing ceremony of the conference. I want to begin by acknowledging and giving our thanks to the co-sponsors of the conference, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, the International AIDS Society, and the World Health Organization. And a special thanks to the University of California, San Francisco, for taking on this conference and sponsoring it from its very inception. Also, a special vote of thanks to the City of San Francisco for being so hospitable to our guests, and a particular note of appreciation to the San Francisco Police. For the past 4 days, we have learned of important advances in our knowledge of AIDS. As our rapporteurs have so eloquently summarized, there is progress on all fronts of our war against the human immunodeficiency virus. The basic sciences have continued to break new ground in understanding the behavior of HIV and of its effects on the immune system, pointing the way to better treatment strategies and vaccines. The clinicians have reported major advances in the treatment of HIV with antiviral compounds and drug combination strategies. Opportunistic infections and cancers are also beginning to yield to therapy. As clinical treatment trials have matured, we can now say with confidence that treatment is working in preventing disease progression, in ameliorating symptoms, improving the quality of life, and now for the first time, a clear prolongation of survival. Involvement of the community in clinical trials has been a major asset to the treatment effort, and we have taken important steps to speed promising treatments through the system. The epidemiologists and prevention scientists have given us a better knowledge of the natural history of HIV disease and the modes of HIV transmission and spread. After 10 years of experience, we can affirm that HIV is not spread by casual contagion, but by specific behaviors that can be modified through education, counseling, and other interventions. The social and behavioral sciences have presented data about the broad effects of AIDS in many areas of society: cost of care, access to treatment, especially by the underclass, issues for women and children, problems in the developing world are all areas of deep concern. Despite our progress, many problems remain. Chief among them is AIDS discrimination, an infectious disease in its own right, spread by ignorance and fear. In the decade of the 90s to come, this is perhaps our most virulent enemy. We must all pledge to continue our battle against AIDS discrimination on all fronts, at the borders, in the workplace, and in our schools and institutions. I hope we have achieved the goals that our program director, Dr. Robert Wachter, outlined 4 days ago. Our theme, From Science to Policy, was to be inclusive of the wide range of disciplines applied to the AIDS problem. We wanted to ensure an environment where delegates could learn, interact, network, and collaborate. And we wanted to emphasize the humanitarian side of the AIDS epidemic. I am especially pleased that the conference was able to include among its delegates, despite the international boycott, approximately 1,000 persons with HIV infection or with AIDS. Our lives and our work are enriched by sharing your experiences and emotions as you cope with this illness. We empathize with your anger and grief and frustration. The media have often asked me, what are the real breakthroughs in the AIDS conference? My response today is that the participation in the conference of patients infected with HIV and the grassroots, community-based organizations that support them is the breakthrough of the conference. It reminds us, this participation reminds us that the conference must have both a brain and a heart. In closing, I would like to ask the audience for a standing ovation for the courage and the collaboration and partnership offered by our most important allies in the fight against AIDS, those who are infected. Please rise in acknowledgement of this important contribution. We are proud that this is a truly international conference. It wouldn't be international without the vigorous participation and commitment of its sponsoring society, the International AIDS Society. Leading this society through its first years of development has been its outgoing president, Professor Lars Olof Kollings. And I would like to call Dr. Kollings to the podium now to conclude with some closing remarks. Thank you. Dr. Kollings.
Dear audience, looking back over the past decade, it is evident that we were not able to control the HIV/AIDS pandemic. The pandemic is continuing to gain momentum, spreading to new areas and new population groups. Transmission of HIV has not been halted in any single country. The rate of spread has slowed in a few countries, but is accelerating in most. The death toll is already a devastating impact in many communities of the most affected areas of the world. We must mobilize our efforts even more than we have already done to contain the pandemic during the 1990s. The perspectives of the International AIDS Society has always been to focus on the individual scientist, the individual health worker, and the HIV-infected individual. This is a very hallmark of the IIS, to represent the individual person actively engaged in the fight against AIDS, to represent the international research community as a voice of reason, based firmly on scientific knowledge and on public health and ethical principles, not governed by political or economical interest or by national prestige, to ensure adherence to the highest possible scientific and ethical principles in our collective research endeavors everywhere. The independent initiatives of scholars, scientists, and inventors have always been decisive in changing the destiny of mankind. Politicians, governments, and industry can only be the followers, exploiting ideas created by free-thinking individuals. Major cross-sectional meetings, such as the International AIDS Society-sponsored annual International AIDS conferences, are important for several principal reasons: to create a forum for exchange of ideas and experiences between representatives of various sectors of science and society, to provide an interface between the authorities and the individual, be it a scientist, field worker, or HIV-infected person, to present the latest scientific information, to provide an image of the frontiers of our current knowledge, to promote the implementation of this knowledge, and to stimulate new ideas. Ideas are often born through the dynamic confrontation between different disciplines through crossing the borders of conventional thinking. Leadership has turned out to be of immense importance in the fight against the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Characteristically, many of the greatest contributions to the efforts have been made by moral leadership through personal integrity, by persons like Jonathan Mann, Everett Koop, Kenneth Kaunda, and the valiant representatives of people with AIDS. Technical solutions and concerted actions are indispensable, but spiritual leadership must clear the way for behavioral changes as well as for mobilizing the awareness and marshalling the resources essential for research and for implementing programs of prevention, treatment, and care. It may seem impossible to change deep-rooted beliefs and risk behaviors. In particular, it has been found difficult to achieve sustained changes of sexual risk behavior. Yet, it must be done. This can be promoted through the strong conviction and advocacy by great personalities, inspiring the workers and organizations engaged in the efforts, as well as inspiring the general public. The IIS has concerned itself with the needs of the infected persons and the protection of human rights, a cornerstone for successful prevention of HIV infection. Prejudice and discriminations are hindrances to implementing intervention programs. It is shameful when unfounded discrimination is ennobled to law, as is the case with the travel restrictions instituted by several countries. The symbolic impact is even greater than the practical. How can we expect the private person to behave in a rational and responsible way to prevent HIV infection or to reject prejudice when states first sets a bad example by instituting irrational laws and then, even worse, after realizing that the laws are unscientific and useless, through political bigotry do not change them? It is in this context that we so much regret the atmosphere which has colored the preparation for this conference, when the free exchange of scientific information is obstructed due to political reasons. However, at this moment, we should look forward and continue to push for travel restrictions to be rejected in all countries. I understand that due to the remarkable political changes towards openness and freedom in Eastern Europe, we may expect that the current travel restrictions for HIV-infected persons will be discarded in some of these countries. Let us hope that such good examples will promote changes in other countries as well. And let us hope that it will be possible to sponsor future international AIDS conferences in North America. For the moment, though, this is very uncertain. IIS has resolved that further IIS-sponsored conferences will not be held in countries that restrict the entry of HIV-infected travelers. Therefore, IIS resolves to withdraw sponsorship of the AIDS International Conference on AIDS in Boston if U.S. immigration policy continues to restrict the travel of HIV-infected persons. And to discourage IIS members and other concerned individuals from attending AIDS conferences in any foreign country whose official policies restrict the travel of HIV-infected persons. This is also in accordance with the views expressed by the Boston organizers. The annual series of international AIDS conferences has become the major event in the AIDS field, synthesizing the knowledge, integrating the efforts, and influencing the policies during the coming year. They are like beacons, guiding us to cope with the disorganized, unfair, horrible, and tumultuous realities of the world outside. To miss a year during this critical phase of the AIDS pandemic would be very damaging to our collective efforts against HIV/AIDS. We are frightened by the thought of the unchecked continued spread of HIV over the world and of the millions of unavoidable victims during the 1990s. Still, we have reason to preserve our confidence that we will eventually be able to contain the pandemic. It will be a long and arduous war, lasting for decades. From this conference, we will remember the increasing and substantial evidence of possibilities to develop vaccines, improve treatment, and diminish risk behaviors. Above all, we will remember San Francisco itself as a principal model for compassion, care, respect, and dignity of HIV-infected persons. Thank you for giving us this experience, and thank you, the San Francisco organizers of this conference, to have mediated this experience and to have built so many bridges for the future. In fact, San Francisco represents a hope for the future. You have shown that it is possible to mobilize communities and that people are willing and capable of changing behavior and assume social responsibility. Let us build on these unique experiences and replicate them elsewhere. This constitutes the great challenge to the world community, to International AIDS Society, to the World Health Organization and other United Nations organizations, to make therapeutic and preventive programs and technologies available globally to all who need them on a basis of equity, on a basis of solidarity. This can only be achieved through coordinated international efforts and will be the ultimate expression of human rights and mean a revolution in attitudes and health care during the 1990s. Thank you.
AIDS is truly a global pandemic, as we have heard at this conference. Over 120 countries are represented here. To respond to this global pandemic has been the creation of the Global Program on AIDS under the sponsorship of the World Health Organization. We are greatly honored here this morning to welcome Dr. Hiroshi Nakajima, Director General of the World Health Organization. Dr. Nakajima.
Mr. Co-Chairman, Honorable Dr. Sullivan, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. We are about to conclude the 6th International Conference on AIDS as the specialized agency of the United Nations responsible for directing and coordinating international health work. The World Health Organization is pleased to have been a co-sponsor since such a conferences continue to provide an important forum for reporting scientific progress leading to control of HIV infection. Like each of the previous conferences, this one has made important contributions to international efforts to prevent and treat HIV infection and AIDS. As we have heard during the past few days, there are a growing number of new approaches that promise a longer life of higher quality, supported medically and socially for persons with HIV infection, and that reawaken hope that an effective vaccine and curative drug may be attainable. Discussion during this conference have also served to remind us that national AIDS program in all countries must deal with both the prevention and the care aspect of HIV infection and AIDS. Let me state clearly that in keeping with 1988 World Health Assembly resolution, every country must protect the human rights and dignity of HIV-infected people and people with AIDS. And avoid discriminatory action against them in regard to travel. I have recently sent a letter to each of WHO's 166 member states, requesting them to review their national HIV/AIDS-related policies and laws, with a view to repealing those that may give rise to discrimination. I appeal to every country to take such action as quickly as possible. History has shown that the sudden appearance of any new diseases can breed great misunderstanding and prejudice. HIV infection is no exception. Further, the fact that HIV infection and AIDS are so closely linked to such an intensely personal issue as sexual practice has added to that misunderstanding and prejudice. Our thorough understanding of the mode of transmission means that sound public health policies and practice should evolve. For such an evolution to keep pace with scientific knowledge require a dialogue among scientists, public health officials, medical practitioners, policymakers, and persons with HIV infection. It is hoped that international AIDS conferences will continue to be one place where this type of dialogue can take place. If they can continue to provide a forum for all those who should participate to participate. These conferences provide a unique opportunity for communication and collaboration on the biomedical, public health, social, ethical, educational, economic, and political aspects of HIV and AIDS. WHO believes that the active participation of HIV-infected people and people with AIDS is indispensable to the objectives of these international conferences. WHO looks forward to the day when future international conferences will not have to deal with the issue of discrimination. To deal effectively and fully with this pandemic, we need solidarity and unity. WHO's priority are to promote dialogue, solidarity, and unity, to strengthen its collaboration with national AIDS prevention and control programs in order to enhance their impact, to strengthen its support of biomedical, epidemiological, and behavioral research, and to continue its effort to ensure the dignity and human rights of HIV-infected persons. We call on the media to continue to play the very important role of informing the public about ways of preventing HIV infection and about new scientific advances in treatment and control. We appeal to the scientific community and the industry, particularly pharmaceutical industry, to pursue with utmost vigor effort to develop effective and safe drugs and vaccine, to make them available at affordable cost to those in need. We encourage the tireless efforts of public health officials whose determination has been so crucial to implementation of the global AIDS strategy. It has been 9 years since AIDS was recognized, 7 years since the human immunodeficiency virus was isolated. The amount learned about HIV and AIDS in that very short period of time rivals the progress made in scientific knowledge at any other time in history. Let our goal be that by the end of this decade, we shall prevent most HIV infections and be able to provide effective treatment and care to those in need. I pledge the full support and leadership of World Health Organization in attaining this goal and in the continuing global effort against AIDS. The action each one of us take now will benefit that of the next century. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very special privilege for me to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Anthony Fauci and I go back a long way, and when the AIDS epidemic struck, he was in the forefront of leadership in mobilizing both research and clinical trials and many other activities in the fight against this epidemic. Dr. Fauci is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease at the National Institutes of Health. He also coordinates the Inter-Institute AIDS research activities, but perhaps most importantly, Dr. Fauci is an active clinician and basic researcher who spends time in his lab and time in the clinic looking after patients and thinking about the disease at that level. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Fauci. It's an honor to have him here. His title is AIDS Research, Considerations for the 1990s. Dr. Fauci.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Nakajima, other speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor and a pleasure to participate in the closing ceremonies of the 6th International Congress on AIDS and to share with you my perspective on AIDS research for the 1990s. Given the constraints on time, I obviously cannot give you a crystal ball projection of what I think can or will be accomplished in each and every area of AIDS research in the next decade. Rather, I will focus on some of the important gaps in our knowledge which remain despite enormous accomplishments over the past decade, many of which you have heard articulated during this conference. Research in AIDS can be empirically divided into natural history and epidemiology, the etiologic agent, pathogenesis, drug development and clinical trials, and vaccine development. First and foremost, however, it is important to underscore the fact that perhaps as much as, or more than any disease, AIDS has reaffirmed the critical role of basic, undifferentiated biomedical research in the ultimate conduct of disease-specific research. Clearly, without the decades of research in basic immunology, microbiology, and molecular biology, we would not have been positioned to meet the scientific challenge of the emergence of HIV infection and the AIDS epidemic. Without our knowledge of the complexity of the human immune system, without the knowledge gained from years of work in animal retrovirology, without the enormous opportunities afforded us by the revolution in molecular biology, without all of these, the extraordinary accomplishments in AIDS research over the past decade, from the discovery of the virus to the development of sensitive diagnostic tests, to the discovery and development of effective, albeit imperfect, antiretroviral drugs, to early vaccine trials, would not have been possible. Certainly, we need to do so much more in AIDS research. However, the accomplishments in research specific to AIDS have provided a cogent argument for our renewed commitment to the continued investment in basic biomedical research in the 1990s, at the same time that we direct substantial resources and energy to applied and disease-specific research on HIV itself. Not only is it critical to the AIDS effort, but it is a solid investment in our future fight against other diseases, many of which are totally unrelated to AIDS. For that is the nature of basic biomedical research. Its dividends are unpredictable, but inevitable. With regard to the specific areas of AIDS research, the broad consideration for the 1990s is simply to fill the gaps in our knowledge that remain from the 1980s, and indeed, there are significant gaps. Because of time constraints, I will only highlight certain representative questions that need to be actively pursued in the 1990s. Research on pathogenesis of HIV infection is still of extremely high priority, since therapeutic and vaccine strategies are critically dependent on understanding these processes. The mechanisms of virus entry into the host via contaminated blood products and intravenous drug use are obvious. However, the initial mechanisms of virus entry via the mucosal membrane and sexual exposure are still not at all clear. Tears and abrasions of rectal mucosa are felt to be the portals of entry into the blood during anal intercourse. Furthermore, genital ulcerations of either partner in vaginal intercourse is significantly associated with an increased chance of transmissibility. However, there is still no solid information regarding the cell types that are first infected with HIV and mucosal exposure, or that carry the virus to the ultimate target cells, a critical point in understanding spread from that initial event. Nor is there any insight into the role, if any, of mucosal immunity in this process. Also, the precise mechanisms of maternal-fetal transmission must be delineated in the 1990s. Animal models need to be actively pursued with these questions in mind, for only with precise delineation of these initial pathogenic events can investigators develop targeted interventions and/or prophylaxes. Another glaring gap in our understanding of the immunopathogenesis of HIV infection relates to the precise mechanisms of CD4 positive T-cell depletion and T-cell functional abnormalities. Does HIV directly kill the CD4 positive T-cell, or does infection indirectly lead to clearance of infected cells by immune-mediated mechanisms? Are infected cells suppressed in their functional capabilities in vivo by certain viral products, as has been demonstrated in vitro? Furthermore, are innocent bystander cells eliminated by autoimmune mechanisms or by syncytia formation in lymphoid tissues? If so, does low-grade, specifically directed therapeutic immunosuppression have any role at all in the treatment of the secondary effects of HIV infection? It has been clearly demonstrated that normal physiological signals in the forms of endogenous cytokines, such as tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6, among others, can induce the expression of HIV in vitro. Since several of these factors are elevated in the plasma of HIV-infected individuals, the possibility exists for specific suppression of these and other inducers of HIV. Studies of HIV gene function have resulted in an explosion of knowledge over the past few years. Yet only after further in-depth understanding of the regulation of HIV gene function can the concept of actually manipulating viral genes and intracellular immunization become a practical reality. A puzzling and universal observation in HIV-infected individuals is the fact that even when viral replication is ostensibly suppressed in certain patients by antiretroviral drugs, complete reconstitution of CD4 T-cell counts is virtually never seen. There may be mild to modest increases in counts, but never the return to normal that one sees frequently following the discontinuation of iatrogenic immunosuppressive drugs in non-HIV-infected individuals. In fact, most HIV-infected patients receiving antiretroviral therapy will continue to have an insidious diminution of CD4 positive T cells following an initial rise, even in the absence of detectable virus replication. These observations suggest that the precursor pool for mature CD4 positive lymphocytes is not functioning properly. We have recently demonstrated in my own lab that thymic precursors of mature CD4 positive T cells, even as early in ontogeny as the triple negative stage, namely CD3, CD4, and CD8 negative, can in fact be infected by HIV. Contrary to dogma, these cells actually express small amounts of surface membrane CD4. These in vitro observations, coupled with the consistent finding that thymuses from HIV-infected individuals are essentially destroyed, strongly suggest that one of the reasons for the lack of complete regeneration of mature CD4 positive T cells, even in the face of suppression of virus replication, may be a defect at the T cell precursor level. We must establish whether this is indeed an important immunopathogenic mechanism, for if it is, then reconstitution of precursor cells will need to be actively pursued as a therapeutic option for the 1990s. The entire area of neuropathogenesis still represents a major gap in our knowledge as we enter the 1990s. What are the mechanisms of neuronal damage in HIV infection of the brain and nervous system? Is it direct infection by HIV itself, direct or indirect damage by viral products, or damage by factors secreted from infected non-neuronal cells? These questions can and will be answered in the 1990s. Certainly, one of the most important scientific challenges in AIDS research for the 90s is the development of safe and effective therapies for HIV infection and its complications. Progress thus far has been extraordinary in comparison to other life-threatening diseases, with the wide availability of at least one effective drug against HIV, namely AZT or zidovudine. In addition, interferon alpha has also demonstrated substantial antiretroviral activity and is approved for use in HIV-infected individuals with Kaposi sarcoma. Furthermore, a number of promising agents, such as DDI and DDC, among others, are currently in clinical trials either alone or in combination with AZT or other drugs. Nonetheless, we are far from reaching our goal regarding therapy, for these drugs have considerable toxicity and are generally only temporarily effective. The goal for the 1990s is and should be a lofty one, namely the ability to completely and indefinitely suppress HIV in infected individuals. The scientific agenda for the treatment of HIV infection for the 90s is the development of a therapeutic regimen consisting of a combination of drugs acting at distinct phases of the virus life cycle. This regimen should be initiated early in the course of infection, administered chronically over an indefinite period of time, and be associated with minimum short-term or long-term toxicities. The ultimate goal of such a regimen would be to effectively suppress virus replication and, as a result, convert HIV infection into a chronic, manageable disease with minimum morbidity and little, if any, negative impact on the life expectancy of the infected individual. Critical to the success of this philosophy is the concept of early intervention, since it has been clearly demonstrated that viral burden increases over time in infected individuals, and increased viral burden is associated with a decrease in CD4 T cells and with disease progression. Furthermore, as mentioned, recent studies indicate that the T cell precursor pool can be infected with HIV. Thus, the greater the degree of depletion of the precursor T cell pool, the more difficult it will be for the mature CD4 positive T cell to be replenished despite the suppression of virus replication. We have spoken about preventing the onset of clinical disease by suppressing the virus itself. What about maintaining a complication-free state in those individuals who already have or who will develop advanced immunosuppression? By this I mean the prevention and treatment of the opportunistic diseases associated with HIV infection. This strategy deserves no less a scientific priority in the 90s than does the treatment of HIV infection itself. In fact, treatment of opportunistic infections poses an even greater challenge than the treatment of HIV itself, since we have already learned more about HIV over the past 6 to 7 years than we know about many of those opportunistic microbes which we've been studying for decades. The scientific agenda for the 90s must include an intensive effort to develop safe and effective treatments for the entire spectrum of opportunistic infections associated with HIV infection, as well as prophylaxes for those infections which occur in high enough frequency to warrant such a strategy. I have referred several times over the past few minutes to the concept of immunological reconstitution. This poses an important challenge of great complexity. Studies on immune reconstitution have been performed using soluble immune enhancers as well as bone marrow transplantation. Results have been marginal at best and always transient. Most recently, in ongoing clinical trials that are showing some promise, infected individuals have been immunized with envelope-depleted killed virus. However, it is important to point out that the success of any immune reconstitution regimen will depend heavily on the efficacy of concomitant anti-HIV therapy. Furthermore, if depletion of thymic precursors by HIV is in fact an important component of the pathogenesis of HIV infection, then cellular reconstitution of this component of the immune system must be pursued actively in the 1990s. Inherent in the scientific agenda of the 90s is an accelerated effort towards the development of a safe and effective vaccine against HIV. In 1989, a number of important basic research studies were reported which established for the first time the feasibility of protective immunity against an HIV-related animal retrovirus, SIV, in the macaque model. Most recently, similar results were reported with HIV in at least 2 chimpanzee studies. In addition, protective immunity against HIV in children born of mothers who have high titers of high-affinity antibody against the principal neutralizing domain of GP120 was suggested. Although these are encouraging findings, it should be pointed out that immediate extrapolation to the human system would be premature. Clearly, one of the important challenges of the 90s will be to delineate as completely as possible the mechanisms of protective immunity in the SIV macaque and HIV chimp model, as well as to perfect the systems for broad specificity and duration of immunity. In addition, the precise viral epitopes which induce protective immunity need to be established. Also, we must continue to delineate the precise nature and mechanisms of cellular and humoral immunity to HIV in the human host. There are a number of candidate vaccines in phase 1 clinical trials throughout the world, as you've heard at this meeting. Most of these have utilized recombinant products. All of them thus far have proven safe, and several have shown good immunogenicity. An important question that is as much philosophical as it is scientific has arisen regarding clinical trials of candidate vaccines. Should vaccines which have proven safe and immunogenic in phase 1 trials in humans be advanced to phase 2-3 efficacy trials based solely on phase 1 data? Or should there be a requirement for demonstration of efficacy of this exact product in the chimp or of a comparable approach in the SIV or other animal model before efficacy trials are initiated in man? There are experienced vaccinologists who feel strongly that only after safety and substantial efficacy have been clearly demonstrated in an animal model should efficacy trials be conducted. However, it is important to point out that there may be different degrees of willingness to tolerate toxicity or different requirements for an extremely high level of efficacy among populations who are at extremely high risk of infection compared to groups whose risk is relatively low. These types of debates will certainly impact the scientific agenda for vaccine development in the 1990s. Finally, AIDS in the 1990s has revolutionized the relationship between the public and scientists involved in AIDS research. The socially, ethically, and politically charged nature of the epidemic has put researchers under an extraordinary degree of public scrutiny. In fact, AIDS research is carried out in a fishbowl atmosphere. Scientists are under almost constant scrutiny, certainly in the United States and probably to a greater or lesser degree throughout the world by the media, politicians, and constituency groups. They are confronted with the accusation by some that they are not doing enough and that they are moving too slowly. I'm not finished. The scientific process, which is the code of our professional existence, is often seen as overly restrictive and even an impediment to solution, and adherence to a set of scientific principles is often interpreted as insensitivity. The most vocal, provocative, and articulate groups among these are the AIDS activists. You heard from Peter Staley, representing ACT UP New York, in the opening ceremonies. You heard from Peter in an eloquent, passionate, angry, and poignant way of his personal fears and frustrations and the frustrations of his activist colleagues. They do have something important to say, and they can contribute constructively to our mission. When it comes to clinical trials, some of them are better informed than many scientists can possibly imagine. Yet, they are sometimes incorrect. Believe it or not. However, we must not disregard everything that they say just because some of the things they say are incorrect. In the interactions between physician scientists and activists, mistakes have been made by both sides. Activists are mistaken when they assume, or at least publicly state, that scientists do not care about them. Most scientists care deeply and are employing all of their energies and talents to accomplish the same goal as the activists are trying to accomplish. To tell scientists that they are not doing enough because they are not immediately fulfilling the needs of HIV-infected persons, many of whom need help now, not 1 or 2 years from now, is to tell them that they are inadequate and failures. This is devastating to a physician scientist who has devoted years to AIDS research, particularly when they themselves see so many of their own patients suffering and dying. We have been trained to be healers of disease and alleviators of suffering. And so when fingers are pointed, the natural reflex of many is to get angry. The same way activists get angry when they feel that scientists are not responsive to their needs. It is particularly devastating and unfair when scientists of good faith and enormous talent are singled out and publicly named as scoundrels. I am not talking about myself, since in one of the hats that I wear, not my basic and clinical research hat, but my science administrator hat, it is part of my job to accept public criticism. In this regard, I have been vilified by the very best. I was long ago initiated into the world of vilification by the godfather himself, Larry Kramer. I am referring to those individuals who devote themselves entirely to basic and clinical research. They can be criticized, but they should not be denigrated publicly. Yes, there is hurt in to accept public criticism. In this regard, I have been vilified by the very best. I am referring to those individuals who devote themselves entirely to basic and clinical research. They can be criticized, but they should not be denigrated publicly. Leon McCusick said it so well when he stated that scientists are experiencing repressed grief themselves, grief and frustration that they do not have the answers for the very people whom they've been trained to help. On the other hand, scientists cannot and should not dismiss activists merely on some of them may be misguided. However, scientists themselves do not have a lock on correctness. Activists bring a very special insight into the disease that they can actually be helpful in the way that we design our scientific approaches. We must join together, for together we are a formidable force with a common goal. In this regard, the challenge for scientists and science policymakers in the 1990s, as important as any specific project that I have just mentioned, is to display understanding, leads us. As scientists, we are professionals fighting an intense war against a terrible disease. We are led by a quest for new knowledge and a desire to help mankind by solving problems critical to the public health. This is the way we serve, but we must never lose sight of the fact
Good morning. It's my turn to do some introductions. Sexual de Peru. Ms. Sevilla founded this grassroots organization dedicated to the education and support of gay men and women. As an openly gay woman, had intended to speak to the concerns of non-governmental organizations, women, and gays and lesbians in developing countries. Is felt by us to be very important in this closing ceremony to the spirit of this conference of bringing people who represent up on stage. Her absence today may indicate her solidarity with the principles of non-discrimination already eloquently therefore she won't be with us today. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to some of the red armband, suggested to us by the Bay Area Physicians for Human Rights as an indication of our solidarity with the principles of non-discrimination. Our next speaker, then, is Dr. E.K. Yao. Dr. Health Working Group on AIDS in Hong Kong. He will speak on the growing problem of AIDS in Asia. Having gotten to know Dr. Yao
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Nakajima, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Closing ceremony of the 6th International Conference on AIDS. If we had access to a time machine and we could go back to 1985, the title of this talk would probably have been, AIDS is not a problem in Asia. For the whole of Asia, and this was out of a total of 14,548, or a mere 0.2% of the total. Cases of AIDS were seen in homosexual and bisexual men, many of whom had been resident abroad for considerable periods and were classified AIDS occurred were in individuals who had received imported blood products contaminated by HIV. In this global context, biological assessment in Asia was conveniently described as Pattern 3. During the early days of the pandemic, reinforced what most Asian communities wanted to believe, that AIDS was foreign to Asia. Many believed that AIDS was an imported problem by placing restrictions and embargoes on its importation. Now back to the future. This is 19 in Asia. What has changed? The number of cases of AIDS reported from Asia has increased. 7 cumulative cases reported to WHO from Asia as at the 1st of June 1990 is still comparatively small and remains the work of the World Health Organization through its global program and through its regional offices has catalyzed awareness of a potential problem in some countries. For many communities in Asia, there was a rude awakening to the problem, triggered by dramatic and explosive increases in HIV infection in India. There is now greater willingness by communities in Asia to examine prevalent behaviors through which infection by HIV. Estimates of the number of homosexual and bisexual men in Asia have been based on questionable premise, and there is very little information about homosexual indicates that sexual practices in Chinese homosexual men is not significantly different from that reported in developed countries. Reliable in Asia is equally wanting. In an adolescent sexuality survey commissioned by the Hong Kong Family Planning Association in Hong Kong, of 18 and 25 admitted to having premarital sex. In addition, 21% of males between the ages of 17 to 20 contact with prostitutes. These findings shocked members of the traditional and conservative Chinese community and serves to indicate that much more research was needed. Oblivious to the sexual behavior and practices in our communities. A third major area of concern is the potential spread of users in Asia. 62,250 individuals comprising about 20,000 inject heroin. Needles are easily available and inexpensive in Hong Kong, and there is a well-organized drug treatment. Yet 19 to 94% of intravenous drug users report sharing needles. Effective methods to disinfect or sterilize needles that which has been presented in Thailand yesterday. With significant levels of risk behavior prevalent in Asia, it was examined. This information on the extent of HIV infection in Asia in this table was collected by the Western Pacific Regional. You can see from this table that among homosexual and bisexual men, in countries reporting doing testing, 80% reported HIV infections in this group. 62% of countries reported infections among intravenous drug users. 2% in heterosexuals and 10% in antenatal follow-ups. This increased prevalence and extension of HIV infection cannot be attributed merely to increased serosurveillance. In Hong Kong, a systematic serosurveillance program for two populations has been in place since HIV antibody testing became available in 1988. Infections in 1985 and 1986 sexual men and in persons with hemophilia. Between 1987 and 1988, a small but definite appearance of These observations are magnified by that seen in serosurveillance studies performed in Thailand and shown in this table. Provided by Dr. Prasad Tongcharan of Thailand. Among female prostitutes, the infection rates range from a low of 0.07 in Thailand in Chiang Mai. Among individuals attending STD clinics, 41% has been reported from Tamil Nadu in India to a high of 10% in Chiang Mai, Thailand. HIV infection and range from a low of 2.2% in Malaysia to a high of 44% from Thailand, Bangkok. Data currently available, one can predict that infections among intravenous drug users and heterosexuals will be the major modes of spread of HIV. Infections rise. Infections among homosexual and bisexual men will continue. The principles of AIDS are the same in Asia as in any country in the developed or developing world. We are very different, and yet we are the same. What is needed to meet this challenge of the growing problem of AIDS in Asia is a greater recognition of the problem. Levels of public education on AIDS during the last 3 years, a recent survey among 1,900 school children revealed that only 50% that there is a problem and needs to be dealt with should lead to greater commitment by governments and by the community to address the problem. In many AIDS identification and involvement with the AIDS education activities initiated by many governments. To counter the threat of AIDS to AIDS will need assistance and resources to implement and evaluate these programs. There is evidence that Asia is awakening to this growing threat. Let's to counter the growing problem of AIDS. Thank you.
Our next speaker to offer our encouragement is Dr. Giovanni of the 7th International Conference on AIDS to be held in Firenze, Italy next summer.
I am very happy to be with you today. I've been very happy to have been here these days to witness and enjoy the National Conference on AIDS in San Francisco. And I wish to warmly welcome each and every one of you and celebrate what I hope will be a most successful 7th International Conference in Italy. Slides will be the last ones of this conference. The next to last one a most enjoyable, hospitable, most beautiful city in the world, always open to and enjoys what it can offer. That's our logo. We hope it will be a winner. It carries from its left side and one from its right side. From its left side is David. David was a man, is a giant, which represented a threat for his life and his culture. He used human passion, and he won the battle against Goliath. So will we. On its right side, you see our slogan, Science Challenging AIDS. We see science as the voice of facts, as the voice of hypotheses, ideas, experiments. All of these include the most dealing with AIDS now and in the future. So please be welcome in Florence. Bear in mind, be late in this respect. Come and have a successful, smiling conference with us.
Our next speaker has been anticipated by all of the spirit of the conference and in the interest of the dialogue that we would hope can continue from this conference, I welcome
But I'm not even done yet.
please. Please.
Give his lecture to us. Dr. Fauci, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased and honored to share a few international conference was held in Atlanta some 5 years ago. That conference was held by Emory University and by the Morehouse School of Medicine. At that time, I was president of the latter institution. In the 10 years that we've known about AIDS, we have made remarkable progress. Its means of transmission and ways to keep the blood supply safe. And we've worked scientific information at hand. But we need to learn so much more. And these and stimulating forum for the exchange of ideas. Dr. Fauci has just I'd like to focus on a different matter. Specifically, how we can AIDS research and how we can translate that research into policy. To save lives, let us not turn our frustrations into theater. Such antagonists. As scientists, advocates, and policymakers, we cannot become symbols by drama. We must find the compassion and the humanity to transcend misunderstanding, hatred, and violence. The truth of the matter is that we need each other. Completely unravel the mysteries of the disease, we must find the ways and the means to work together. HIV and AIDS throughout the world, and to work together to prevent the spread of the virus to others. We must work tirelessly to reach our citizens with credible and persuasive prevention information. responsibility is a key factor in limiting the spread of the virus. We must work together of increased emphasis on health promotion and disease prevention. Because AIDS has and our minority communities, we must develop culturally sensitive and relevant programs to combat the disease. By the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention of the National Association of Black and White Men Together. Gay and bisexual men are far less likely to practice safe sex than white gay or bisexual. Preventing the onset of symptoms and in treating the disease, we have to keep working to rapidly put those benefits. Because discrimination is not medically nor morally justified. We must this country to support passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act under consideration by the United States Congress. A letter that I wrote to the Honorable Thomas S. Foley, Speaker of the House of Representatives in the Congress on May 1st. Unless they have other infections or illnesses for which any food service worker should be restricted. Further, I would add that any policy based on fears and misconceptions about HIV to the public health. And because we are constantly looking for productive leads in the fight against government and the private sector must keep supporting our researchers and scientists with appropriate that AIDS will generate strong and passionate discussions on a wide variety of topics. That's why we must learn to listen to each other, to learn from each other, and to work together. Instead, AIDS must bring us together. From adversity, we must seek cooperation, tolerance, understanding, and caring. Compassion must be our motivation and our guidance. Especially in helping to craft more compassionate policies for the approval and the distribution of drugs by the FDA and in developing applicable research projects at the National Institutes of Health. That cooperation helps our concern must transcend personal and political boundaries. The growing AIDS crisis must be tackled through global strategy. As you've heard during this conference, worldwide, over 100 countries have reported cases of AIDS. With the virus worldwide by the year 2000. And some say that figure is underestimated. I am concerned about the spread of AIDS in developing countries. we must do all that we can to help. For example, may be infected with the virus. This is a catastrophe for a continent where currently than $3 annually per person is devoted to health care. That is why my department is involved with countries worldwide. We're also working closely with many international efforts, including those sponsored by the World Health Organization. And that support is reflected by the fact that the United States is the largest contributor of funds and of the United States can provide worldwide is to utilize our biomedical research efforts to chart unknown territory. The information we uncover could be decisive in helping our citizens and citizens of other lands fight AIDS and other. We're channeling new resources and personnel to strengthen our capabilities in the biomedical, behavioral, and technological sciences. The President's fiscal year 1991 budget will continue to provide substantial funding for biomedical. At the National Institutes of Health and at the, I'm staying right here. This figure does not include increases for research, prevention, and money for AIDS. AIDS research will continue to receive substantial support. Related to the AIDS crisis, bringing the total support for such activities to $1.7 billion year 1991. AIDS research, prevention, and education ranked second only to cancer. But we must also remember that there is no magic price tag, no guaranteed price for success. That is part of the frustration that all of us feel. Another task is to make treatment more effective. Life-threatening diseases. It is evolving into a more compassionate and practical system for coping with this crisis. 1 month ago, on May 21st, the Public Health Service published a proposed policy for the expanded availability with the cooperation of drug manufacturers. The drugs could be made available in the United States to citizens with HIV infection who have therapeutic alternatives and who have immediately life-threatening diseases and cannot participate in clinical trials. Of Project Inform, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, the National Association of People with AIDS, and representatives of the department. This shows what we can do when we work together. We must be ever for the removal of ignorance, discrimination, and mistrust. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in time. The wisdom to stand together. The AIDS epidemic can divide us, or it can unite us. It can lure us into accusations, blame, or hostility, or it can show us our own and united in common cause. Because in the last analysis, that is what this conference is all about. And our common declaration as the conference concludes. Thank you and Godspeed in your work.
Thank you very much. Statements are tempted to thank individually the many staff and volunteers who have participated. That desire is limited by our schedules, but we do thank you. I would simply say that an enormous effort we are especially proud of the collaboration with a community of HIV-infected persons and their advocates at all stages, planning and conduct of this meeting. I would like to thank each delegate for your participation. If our laws can be changed so that this meeting can come back to the United States. I can add, as the incoming president of the International AIDS Society, that the Society will remain committed to efforts to eliminate laws in any country out that the success of these efforts will only be as strong as the membership of the organization. And I ask you to join the organization and participate by letting us know the ways in which we can better address the problems that we face. That wish to participate, a contingent will meet in the front of the Moscone Center. Thank you again for your attendance. We look forward to seeing each other in Florence, and I now declare the 6th International Conference on AIDS officially closed.
This week on Book Notes.
Nobody had a clue about this godforsaken stretch of, abandoned archipelago.